Hey folks, with the release of Phase 3, Blizzard has added a new level of difficulty to Titan Rune dungeons in Wrath Classic. The official name for this is Titan Rune Beta dungeons, but most of the community just calls them Heroic++ dungeons, or H++ for short. In this video, I'll go over everything that you need to know about the affixes and reward structure for the new Titan Rune dungeons. As a quick note though, this video will be aimed towards people who already have a basic understanding of the original Titan Rune dungeons, since I want to focus specifically on what has changed, rather than explaining everything from scratch. If you're brand new to the system, I'd recommend watching my video from a few months ago, which goes over the basics of the system, as well as the affixes for the original Titan Rune Alpha dungeons. And finally, if you'd like a refresher on the baseline mechanics for every single heroic dungeon, I've linked a playlist with all of my Wrath dungeon guides in the video description below, and it even contains a guide for the Trial of the Champion, which I released earlier this week. With all of that out of the way, let's dive into the new Heroic++ dungeons. For starters, I think it's important to establish how this new difficulty level actually works, and the new rewards that you can earn by completing it. In order to start a Heroic++ dungeon, you'll first need to enter the dungeon on a regular Heroic difficulty and interact with the nearby Titan Rune. From here, you can select either the Alpha or Beta Protocol, depending on which difficulty level you want to run. The only exception to this is Trial of the Champion, as the only available difficulty is Heroic++. Once you've selected the Beta Protocol, a small orb will appear within the room, and once all 5 party members have channeled into it, the hard mode will be activated, and all mobs will be buffed with the new affix for that dungeon. As for the rewards, each boss in a Titan Rune Beta dungeon will now drop one guaranteed piece of loot from the 10-man version of Ulduar. That's not all though, because they'll also drop at least one additional piece of gear, which has a 50% chance to be from the original Heroic loot table, and a 50% chance to be from the 10-man versions of Nox Ramus, Obsidian Sanctum, or Eye of Eternity. This means that you effectively have zero incentives to run the older Titan Rune Alpha dungeons, as the entire loot pool from that difficulty is also present in Titan Rune Beta dungeons. While this is pretty neat on its own, the most notable change to the reward structure is a new currency called Sidereal Essence. Each time you kill the final boss of a Heroic++ dungeon, you're guaranteed to loot a single Sidereal Essence. This currency is used to buy items that drop off hard mode 10-man Ulduar bosses, and they're all sold by a vendor named Animated Constellation, which can be found near the badge vendors in Dalaran. The cheapest items you can buy will only cost 15 Sidereal Essence, but some of the more valuable items such as weapons can cost up to 38 of the currency. As previously mentioned, you only get 1 essence for completing a dungeon, and you can only complete a maximum of 13 dungeons per day, so it may take you a while to farm some of the more expensive hard mode items. Lastly, in case it wasn't obvious, the Heroic++ dungeons have been updated to drop Emblems of Conquest up from Valor, and the bag for completing the daily Heroic dungeon now rewards Emblems of Triumph. That covers all of the general changes to the reward systems, so now we can discuss all of the mechanical changes for every dungeon affix. As you might expect, one of the main changes is a buff to the damage and health modifiers. In Alpha dungeons, all mobs dealt 30% additional damage and had 100% additional health, but in Beta dungeons, this bonus has been increased to 40 and 120% respectively. As for the specific dungeon mechanics, I'll be discussing them in order from least to most amount of changes, which means we'll be kicking things off with the Frost Rune in Utgard Pinnacle and Utgard Keep. This was generally considered to be one of the worst affixes in the Titan Rune Alpha dungeons, and unfortunately it has barely changed at all. The Glaciate debuff still functions exactly as it did before, but now you'll also occasionally receive a different debuff called Fire Blast, which deals 100% of your health and damage over 10 seconds. In order to remove this debuff, you'll need to run over the ice patches left behind by players with Glaciate. If you successfully remove Fire Blast, you'll receive a buff called Blistering Fury, which grants you 50% critical strike for 30 seconds. So, before I discuss this any further, it's important to note that for the first few days of Phase 3, the Fire Blast debuff was actually bugged and only dealt 10 actual damage instead of 10% of a player's health. Now, Blizzard did fix this a few days into the patch, but unfortunately this change also occurred right as I was about to publish this video, meaning I then needed to spend many additional hours testing, recording, re-scripting, and re-editing this guide, so if I sound a bit more tired during this section of the video, that's why. Now, initially I had expected the Fire Blast debuff to be really difficult after it got fixed, but thankfully that doesn't appear to be the case. Provided your group remains somewhat close together, it's usually easy enough to remove your Fire Blast debuff on an ice patch before you take too much damage. Additionally, Fire Blast is affected by damage reductions and resistances, so in practice it doesn't really deal 100% of your health even if you aren't able to remove it. When I cleared Utgard Pinnacle and Keep earlier this morning after the hotfix, the original Glaciate debuff ended up killing multiple people, but we didn't have a single death due to Fire Blast. Overall, it seems that this new addition to the Frost Rune isn't actually that difficult to manage, even if it appears pretty scary on paper. Up next, we'll take a look at the Arcane Rune, which is present in Violet Hold, the Oculus, and the Nexus. Just like before, this affix has received fairly minimal changes, as it still causes mobs to periodically summon mirror images during combat. However, instead of the mirror images always spam casting arcane missiles, there are now 3 different variations. One of the images is the same Arcane Missiles version from before, now there's also a melee DPS and a healer in each set. The melee image will fixate a random player and attempt to auto-attack them, while the healer will attempt to spam cast Holy Nova. Overall, this version of the affix is infinitely easier than the one we had before, as the melee and healer adds deal way less damage than the Arcane Missile variants. Additionally, the mirror image that spam casts Holy Nova does a trivial amount of healing to nearby mobs, so it's really not a major concern. This change also means that the Whelpling pulls at the start of the Oculus are far less deadly, as the chances of a DPS being randomly 100-0'd are much lower with the reduction to the Arcane Missile images. That's not all though, because killing the mirror images will also grant every member of your party a stacking 5% buff to their movement and attack speed. This buff caps out at 6 stacks, and it lasts for 30 seconds. It'll sometimes fall off in between portals within Violet Hold, but as long as you're chain pulling properly in the Nexus or the Oculus, it's pretty easy to maintain the 30% attack and movement speed buff for most of the dungeon. While the changes to the Arcane Rune and Heroic++ are pretty minor, I actually think it's really fun to play around, and I hope Blizzard sticks with this design in future phases of Wrath Classic. Now, we need to talk about the Shadow Rune, and I'm gonna try really hard to stay on topic and not spiral off into a rant about how absolutely garbage the changes are in Heroic++. This rune is present in Astral Narub and ahn'kahet the Old Kingdom, and just like before, it causes enemies to randomly web wrap a player, forcing their party member to break them out. On Heroic++, Blizzard has added a new buff called Shadow Imbuement, which causes your abilities to deal more damage or healing, and you gain stacks of this buff while trapped inside of a web wrap. Now, you may be thinking, wow, that sounds like a really fun and interesting risk-reward mechanic. The longer you stay webbed, the more damage you deal when you get broken out. What's not to like? And if that was the only thing that got changed, I would probably agree. Unfortunately, Blizzard also made it so the web wrap just fucking kills you if it doesn't get broken within 10 seconds. This is such an unbelievably terrible change, as it won't impact you 99% of the time, but whenever you do end up in a situation where you're unable to break someone out of a web wrap, the punishment is just now death. This is especially problematic because the web wrap mechanic has always been extremely janky. Sometimes it can web a player from halfway across the dungeon while they're running back, and they have zero counterplay, they just die. Additionally, there are weird situations in Astral Narub where you can be web wrapped in midair, meaning you're completely screwed unless someone in your group is watching for this and breaks you out with ranged abilities. These issues have existed since the original version of this affix, but they were never actually a problem until Blizzard decided to make the web wraps kill you. The most ridiculous example of this can be seen in the tunnel immediately after Hadronox. Many players running Astral Narub have over a decade of muscle memory telling them to jump off the web, ignore the ads, and run past them into the giant hole. Unfortunately, doing this in a Heroic++ dungeon will always result in one of your party members getting wrapped, and since everyone else is already falling down the hole towards an Uberok, the wrapped players are dead with zero counterplay. The only way to avoid this is making sure your entire group knows to stay and kill the ads before jumping into the pit, but it only takes one pug running in early to get everyone else killed. Okay, so the insta-kill web wraps are pretty bad, but at least there's that new damage buff, right? Well, not really, because after all, this is a game made by Blizzard Entertainment, so the buff is extremely bugged, and most of the time it doesn't actually work. I'm not even entirely sure what causes it to not proc, but in some cases the buff will just sit on the player and do nothing even when they're actively using damage and healing abilities. And I know I've already talked about this rune for way too long, but it's also important for me to note that the web wraps also got a health buff, making it much more difficult to break them with passive AoE effects such as Consecration or Death and Decay. These abilities are still helpful, and your group should still try to remain tightly stacked so you can easily break webs. However, the health increase means you are required to hard swap to any new web wraps and break them using single target abilities, as otherwise they'll take forever to die. Also, I have no concrete proof of this, but I feel like the web wraps will target tanks far more often than they did before. Back during the alpha versions of these dungeons, I got web wrapped pretty infrequently on my prop paladin, but in the beta versions, I've sometimes been web wrapped 3 times in the span of 10 seconds, which is absolutely fucking insane. This means certain pulls will arbitrarily end up being far more difficult, as the tank may end up getting chain stunned, causing the mobs to turn around and randomly one-shot a DPS. Since Consecration is also no longer enough to break web wraps on its own, tanks basically have no counterplay for this and need to rely on their group members breaking them out as quickly as possible. Okay, so anyways, the Shadow Rune absolutely sucks, but at least now we can move on to the next, and just fucking kidding, because if everything I already said wasn't bad enough, the Shadow Rune also grants mobs 150 bonus health instead of the standard 120% present in most other dungeons. Why do these mobs have 30% additional health on top of the worst affix currently present in Titan Rune Beta dungeons? Because fuck you. Apparently Blizzard forgot to have their interns properly playtest this before it got released. Okay, anyways, moving on for real this time to the Blood Rune, which is found in Gundrak and Draktheron Keep. This was arguably the worst affix in Titan Rune Alpha dungeons, but unlike the Shadow Rune, Blizzard actually decided to improve this one instead of doubling down on the things that made it terrible. For starters, the blood pools dropped by enemies are functionally the same, though their visual appearance received an update which makes it much easier to spot. However, thanks to a new change in the Heroic++ version of the dungeon, you won't even need to worry about moving mobs out of the blood pools. At the start of the dungeon, you'll find a mysterious cauldron, and interacting with it will give you a debuff called Witch Doctor's Brew. This causes you to take 5% of your health and damage every 5 seconds, but it also allows you to poison Blood of the Loa pools spawned by enemies. Poisoning the pools not only removes their healing effects, it also causes enemies standing inside of the pool to take 1% of their health and damage every second. The best part is that these poison puddles have no effect on players, so your entire group can sit inside of it with 0 consequences. The best way to handle this affix is to have your tank, and only your tank, interact with the mysterious cauldron at the start of the instance. The buff lasts for 5 minutes, and it'll allow them to instantly poison every healing puddle the moment it spawns. You don't even need to do anything special to make this happen. You'll just passively poison the healing puddles the moment you step inside of them. There are also additional mysterious cauldrons located after every single boss, so your tank should be able to easily refresh their buff throughout the dungeon. Overall, this affix went from being arguably the hardest one in Titan Rune Alpha dungeons to the easiest one in Beta dungeons by a mile. Hopefully whoever designed the new Shadow Rune is taking notes. Anyways, next up we have the Plague Rune, which is only present in the Culling of Stratholme. Before I discuss the changes, I want to first touch upon the original effect where mobs have a chance to apply the zombie plague to you upon landing an auto attack. While this functions exactly the same in beta dungeons as it does in alpha ones, Blizzard actually changed it a bit after I made my original video covering the Titan Rune Alpha dungeons. I originally stated that you would need a disease dispel to counter the zombie plague, but this is no longer necessary due to a new item called Pure Stratholme Holy Water. There are a few crates located near the Titan Rune at the start of the instance which contain this holy water, and it also drops quite often from mobs within the instance. This holy water is off the GCD and will instantly dispel diseases from any nearby targets, allowing you to easily counter the debuff without using a single actual dispel. The holy water also does moderate damage to nearby undead or demons, so you can spam this on large trash pulls to save a bit of time. The main change in the beta version of the dungeon are the giant zombie horrors that you've probably already noticed by now in my footage. There are a bunch of these mobs scattered throughout the initial section of the dungeon with the Scourge waves, and there are 2 more towards the end of the dungeon in the Burning Street. These zombie horrors don't do anything special, but they have a ridiculous amount of health, which is problematic seeing as how Culling of Stratholme is the only dungeon with a timer. Thankfully, Blizzard added an item called Holy Hand Grenade, which you can pick up from the crates near the Titan Rune at the start of the dungeon. These grenades allow you to one-shot a zombie horror, and you'll be able to pick up 5 of them in total from the crates near the Titan Rune. It's important to note that there are no other ways to obtain Holy Hand Grenades throughout the dungeon, so you'll have to use your 5 grenades wisely. Before you get any cheeky ideas about grouping up multiple horrors and using 1 grenade, the effect is single target, so you can only kill a maximum of 5 horrors by using these grenades. Also, there are a good bit more than 5 horrors present throughout the dungeon, so you will have to kill some of them without the help of the grenade. Personally, I'd recommend using 3 grenades on horrors in the first section of the dungeon, and then saving 2 for the fire streak towards the end. Due to the nature of the first section of Culling of Stratholme, you'll be spending a lot of time running back and forth to fight waves of Scourge. This means you'll have plenty of time to drag a few zombie horrors along with you and chip them down as you clear out the waves. Overall, this affix is pretty simple, though the timing can be a bit tight if your DPS isn't the best. I did this recently with a fairly geared group, and we made it to the Infinite Corruptor with only 5 minutes left on the timer. While this was still more than enough time to get the kill, players with lower gear scores may find themselves struggling to beat the timer due to the massive amount of health present on the zombie horrors. As a final note, using one of the Holy Hand Grenades will buff all nearby party members with Holy Imbuement, and this increases damage and healing done by 20% for 30 seconds. While this buff is nice and will save a tiny bit of time throughout the dungeon, I wouldn't really recommend trying to play around it. If you're able to make good use of this buff, that's awesome, but first and foremost, your priority should be to use the grenades to clear out the zombie horrors. The last of the original affixes is the Titan Rune, which is found in Halls of Stone and Halls of Lightning. This rune is a bit different compared to the ones I've discussed so far, as it's effectively a complete rework of the original Alpha affix. For reference, the original effect included a massive buff to enemy health on top of the existing 100%, and it caused mobs to pulse titanic power onto nearby players, granting them a stacking buff that increased damage done by 1% and damage taken by 2%. In my original video, I noted that Blizzard seemed to be encouraging players to chain pull in order to keep the buff rolling, as the damage increase would in theory allow you to offset the massive health buff gained by all of the mobs. Unfortunately, this isn't how things worked out in practice, as players ended up pulling conservatively due to the increase in damage taken, which made dungeons turn into a massive slog. With the changes to the beta versions of these dungeons, Blizzard has successfully achieved their original goal and then some, as the Titan Rune is the most fun dungeon affix by far. For starters, the Titanic Power debuff now only grants a damage buff and no longer increases your damage taken. That's not all though, as once you reach the maximum of 100 stacks, you get an additional set of buffs which are basically miniature versions of the Keeper effects from the Yogg-Saron raid encounter. The buffs you get are as follows. Fortitude of Frost makes you deal 10% increased damage, grants you 20% damage reduction from all sources, and gives you a single use of a cheat death passive. Fury of the Storm also makes you deal 10% more damage, but it also gives you 20% additional health and allows you to instantly kill immortal enemies. More on that part later. Resilience of Nature gives you another 10% damage, 20% health received, 15% mana every 5 seconds, and it'll restore 20 sanity to you if you don't use abilities for 5 seconds. Once again, I'll discuss the sanity part in a little bit. Finally, Speed of Invention gives you 10% damage and 20% movement speed, and it also causes you to deal bonus damage to, quote, destabilize Saronite-based enemies. Now, a lot of these buffs are pretty straightforward, and I'll quickly note that Resilience of Nature means your healer will never need to stop for mana, allowing you to chain pull for the entire dungeon. This is ideal because you'll need to constantly chain pull if you want to stay at 100 stacks of Titanic Power and keep these really strong buffs. Now I'll address the elephant in the room, which is the part of the buffs that refer to Sanity and Immortal Saronite enemies. This is referring to a new mob called an Immortal Crusher Tentacle, and these things will pop up throughout Halls of Stone and Halls of Lightning. When you get near one, it'll begin channeling Diminished Power, which reduces the damage done by all players by 99% until the mob is hit by a melee attack. Once you've engaged the Crusher Tentacles, they'll begin slowly draining your sanity, and you'll need to kill them off before your sanity hits 0 and you get mind controlled. Since the Fury of the Storm buff allows you to kill the Immortal Tentacle when it reaches 5% health, it's mandatory for you to have all of these buffs in order to actually finish off the tentacles. Additionally, if you find yourself struggling to kill it in time, you can stop attacking to benefit from the sanity regen of Resilience of Nature. If you wait long enough, this buff will restore more sanity than the tentacle drains, so the dungeon should be easily doable even if your group is under-geared. Overall, both Halls of Stone and Halls of Lightning are incredibly easy thanks to these buffs, which I don't think is a bad thing, considering running these dungeons is some of the most fun I've had in WoW Classic thus far. The only slightly difficult section of these dungeons is right at the start of Halls of Lightning, since you'll need to immediately fight an Immortal Crusher Tentacle. Since the dungeon has just started, you won't have any stacks of Titanic Power, so your tank will actually need to run further ahead and drag additional mobs back on top of the Crusher Tentacle. This will allow your group to gain stacks of the debuff at a much faster pace, meaning you should be able to kill off the tentacle without sitting around and waiting to gain stacks. All that's left to talk about now is the new affix, the Gladiator Rune, which is present in Trial of the Champion. This rune will cause spectators in the crowds to throw a veritable minefield of obstacles throughout the arena. Most of the items thrown are things such as explosive traps, freezing traps, or banana peels, which will negatively impact players. There's really not a ton to say about these things, other than the fact that they limit your movement, and you should obviously avoid running over these obstacles whenever possible. However, the spectators will rarely throw one of 3 beneficial items. 2 of these items are the berserking and healing buffs that can typically be found in battlegrounds like Warsong Gulch or Wrathy Basin, but you can also pick up some roses, which grant you a stacking 2% damage buff. While the berserking buff can be a bit useful provided it's easy for you to access, the other 2 buffs feel a little bit ill-conceived. Every single time I tried to grab the healing buff, I ended up stepping on a few traps in the process, which kinda defeated the purpose. Also, while the roses technically can stack, they spawn so infrequently that I've never managed to get more than one of them at a single time. As a result, you're effectively risking taking extra damage just to get a 2% damage buff, which is not worth it at all. While this affix can make things a little bit tricky for encounters like the Black Knight, which forces you to move away from exploding ghouls and patches on the ground, this pales in comparison to the true challenge of the dungeon, which is Argent Confessor Palatrus. During the second phase of her fight, Palatrus will summon a Memory of the Past, which casts an unavoidable AoE fear. This is really bad in combination with the dungeon affix. Sometimes you'll just get feared straight into multiple traps and banana peels, causing you to be stunned and take a bunch of extra damage. Considering Palatrus is already an extremely healing intensive fight in a vacuum, this added damage will cause you to wipe over and over and over. I did this dungeon multiple times with a geared group, and every single time we struggled on Palatrus. If you're doing this dungeon, I would highly recommend you always bring a shaman with you, as Tremor Totem allows you to completely negate the fear. The boss still won't be a pushover, even if you have a shaman, but this will prevent any unfair wipes to bad RNG from the fears. Also, unless you have extremely good survivability, I would advise against picking up the berserking buff, as it causes you to take an additional 10% damage. This may not seem like much, but Palatrus already puts out a monstrous amount of damage, so 10% can easily mean the difference between life or death. And with that, we've covered everything you need to know about the Titan Rune Beta dungeons in Wrath of the Lich King Classic. If you'd like to learn more about all of the dungeons in Wrath Classic, you can find my playlist of guides linked in the video description below. Finally, if you found this video helpful, I'd encourage you to toss it a like, as that'll help other people find it as well.